Today, we're going to take a look at some of the Old Testament laws regarding offerings, uh, food, and animal sacrifice. So, this will be an interesting lesson, I'm sure. But also, I want to remind you that we are in the middle of High Holy Days, and that this week we will celebrate the Jewish atonement. So, we'll get a little more explanation for that as we get into the story here. This is just a piece of artwork that I thought was interesting, showing what a Sabbat meal would be like. And it is painted by a Jewish artist. So we are in session 2 of the book of Genesis. Our overall theme throughout the Old Testament is people, land, and the struggle. Just a quick reminder of our class format. So right now it is tashlish, which comes from the Hebrew word meaning to cast and referring to the intent to cast away our sins by some meaningful and ancient Jewish custom. You may look up these Jewish customs at chabad.org library, and you can click on the link that's attached below and get more information on the meaning of the ancient Jewish custom of atonement. Is very interesting. And it is 10 days long, for 10 days of repentance. Some new terminology for this week. Polytheism, or to be polytheistic, means to believe in multiple gods, like most of the ancient cultures did. Particularly, I think we always think immediately of the Egyptians because they're so well known for their multitude of gods, or maybe the Greeks and the Romans are familiar to you as well. And in ancient Mesopotamia, during the times that we're studying, of course, it was polytheistic culture. We think then about our beliefs, modern day beliefs. We call ourselves monotheistic, believing in one God. And somewhere along the line, there had to be a transition that was made. So in the process of that transition, we have this word henotheistic, which means that you have a devotion to one single primary God, like Yahweh, but you're still accept the idea that other cultures have other gods, and that there still are other gods, but you choose to only worship Yahweh. So it's a transition or a movement away from polytheistic, where you believe in multiple gods, and then into henotheism, where you believe in your God as the only God for you, but you still believe that other cultures have their gods. And then today we believe in one God, and we are a monotheistic Christianity. So I'm going to show you some maps in the next few slides. I say, where in the world is Waldo? Well, I mean, where is ancient Israel? This is a current map of the near Middle East. So you can see it's focused on the geography, and it's very, very dry. You can tell by the sandy color that it's meant to represent dry areas of land. And then it's also very mountainous on the edges. And so I want you to become familiar with how the land and geography looks, because it plays a significant role in the development of Israel. So ancient Israel, or ancient Israelites, resided in what is today modern day Iraq, along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. It is also up into what is modern day Syria, and then coming down along the border of the Mediterranean into modern day Jordan. So this is a crescent shape following the water that would have been usable for land irrigation for animals and people. We can't live without water. So in the next map, you'll see a darkened part of the Middle East that is called the Fertile Crescent. This area supported the cultures that lived along there. And as you can see by the previous map, that it is a dry land. Cultures had to settle near water, so they were very, very close in proximity to each other. And that, since they're close in proximity to each other and water is so vital, there are often disputes over water and grazing lands. So in this map, you'll really see the highlighted area that is called the Fertile Crescent, and it extends all the way over into what's the Lower Egypt Valley, the Delta area next to the Mediterranean Sea. We see Abraham's route highlighted in a little bit of a darker green, and we'll get to Abraham in a couple more lessons. But this is where we say Abraham came from Ur, but we'll explain that a little more in the future. But just keep in mind what this area looks like geographically. It's very dry, and the area that's close to the waters that's available, that's good water and clear water for use for human and animal consumption, that it is all near the rivers. And that area is called the Fertile Crescent. Here's another highlighting of the same area, and you can see the many different cultures and cities that settled along this arced area. Okay, people, land, and struggle. The one true God, Yahweh, created humankind. He gave land and rules to live by, and disobeying Yahweh's laws results in struggles to maintain and keep the gift of land and keep the Israelite people united. That is our theme that we're looking at through the next few lessons, actually through most of the Old Testament as well. So we'll focus on chapters 4 and 5 of Genesis this week. This is the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel continues the struggle that was carried on after Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. The offerings that Cain and Abel bring to God, they both make an offering, but one is different. So how are they different, and what does that mean? Well, Cain's offering is not the best of the first fruits that he has grown. So Cain disobeyed a direct command to bring the best of the first fruits. But then we have to stop and think, well, where and when did this law even come from? And where did all the people come from when we just had only Adam and Eve created in the last lesson? And how did Cain and Abel even know where they were to bring an offering or a sacrifice? This will help you to remember that these are stories that were written down after the Babylonian exile to show people from the descendants of the patriarchs that they have these things in common, these stories, this background, these laws, and so on, that will tie them together as a people. And so from chapter 4, we read, when they grew up, this is the children of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, and Cain cultivated the ground. When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lambs from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift. This made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected. So let's take a little look at some of the offering laws of this time. And And how did people even know? Well, know what to do. This is one of the ways we know that these stories are written long after the fact, because we're describing Cain and Abel, who are the sons of Adam and Eve, which would be the original creation according to Jewish tradition and Old Testament writing. So now we already have laws in place, but we must have had people in civilizations and cultures already. Otherwise, why would we have had these laws to look for? So let's think about the book of Leviticus, which is a book of law in the Old Testament. Leviticus and Deuteronomy are the two books that will give most of the laws that Jewish culture lives by. So the celebration of first harvest is described in Leviticus 23 as, "Then the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you enter the land I am giving you and you harvest its first crops, bring the priest a bundle of grain from the first cutting of your grain harvest. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest will lift it up before the Lord so it may be accepted on your behalf. On the same day, you must sacrifice a 1-year-old male lamb with no defects as a burnt offering to the Lord." So this is directed to Moses. The Lord is telling Moses to tell the people about this law. So that means they must be on their way from the exodus of Egypt towards the land of Canaan to resettle Canaan. So this is much longer after the story of Cain and Abel, but yet this is the law that they are following in the story of Cain and Abel. Also, this is directed to Moses, but it would have probably been carried out and followed through by Aaron and the priests. Aaron was the first priest. He is the brother of Moses. And we are in the book of Leviticus here for this, finding this direction for the offering. And Leviticus is the laws that are given to the priesthood. So then, continuing on, it says, with this, you must present a grain offering consisting of 4 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil. It will be a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. You must also offer 1 quart of wine as a liquid offering. Do not eat any bread or roasted grain or fresh kernels on that day until you bring this offering to your Lord. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. And also in Exodus, which is when they're in the Sinai Peninsula, waiting to enter the promised land. In Exodus, it says, "This is what you must do when the Lord fulfills the promise he swore to you and to your ancestors. When he gives you the land where the Canaanites now live, you must present all firstborn sons and firstborn male animals to the Lord, for they belong to him. A firstborn donkey may be bought back from the Lord by presenting a lamb or a young goat in its place. But if you do not buy it back, you must break its neck. However, you must buy back every firstborn son." So now this is in Exodus, and it also is talking about your ancestors. So again, you can know that this is written much after the fact of Cain and Abel. Genesis chapter 4 and 5 continued. Yahweh does not condone human sacrifice, although it was practiced by other cultures in the area. For that reason, it is not thought to be unreasonable later, when we come to the story of Abraham, to sacrifice Isaac in a later story. So the story of Abraham is before the time the laws are written down. The cultures that are around Canaan offer sacrifice of firstborn sons to their gods. So it's kind of a conundrum when you think about it. I mean, here's Abraham who's taking his son Isaac and going to offer him to the Lord as directed. But when we get to that story, we'll have a little more better understanding. So offering a firstborn son is a symbolic dedication to Yahweh. You'll raise up your child in the ways of the one God, Yahweh. Leviticus 18:21 says, do not permit any of your children to be offered as a sacrifice to Molech, for you must not bring shame on the name of your God. I am the Lord. The Molech was one of the gods that children were sacrificed to. In Deuteronomy also it says, when the Lord your God goes ahead of you and destroys the nations and you drive them out and live in their land, do not fall into the trap of following their customs and worshiping their gods. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how do these nations worship their gods? I want to follow their example. You must not worship the Lord your God the way that other nations worship their gods, for they perform for their gods every detestable act that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters as sacrifices to their gods. So the instruction is clearly saying we, the followers of Yahweh, the one true God, do not sacrifice our children. We do not defile our own people. So be careful to obey all the commands I give you. You must not add anything to them or subtract anything from them. All right, so at this point, I want to take you on to a video. And
the Old Testament's book of Leviticus is a bit of a paradox. It's the first book that Orthodox Jews read growing up, but probably the last that a Christian would read. Nearly half of the 613 commandments in the Torah, the first 5 books of Hebrew Scripture, have their basis in the book of Leviticus. So anyone who wants to understand religious Judaism must understand this book. On the other hand, while Christians do quote individual passages selectively, love your neighbor in chapter 19 gets quite a bit of traction, there's not much interest in something as seemingly irrelevant as regulations on what fabrics you can make clothing from in the same chapter. Leviticus sits in the middle of the Torah. First, Genesis and Exodus lead us into the covenant with Abraham and the Sinai covenant with Moses. And then after the book of Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy narrate the Israelites wandering in the wilderness through the arrival at the entrance to the promised land. As they prepare to enter, Leviticus provides the house rules that Israel will be under to live there as God's family. We're going to look at 3 sections of the book. The first part, which deals with the sacrificial system, then a section that scholars call the Manual of Impurities, and that's where the seemingly odd bits about leprosy and so forth come in. And then in chapter 16, we will look at the Day of Atonement, what becomes the holiest day of the year in Judaism. The first 2 chapters of Leviticus describe the sacrificial system that, in theory, was operational in the Jerusalem temple. Some people ascribe the authorship of the book of Leviticus to Moses, along with the rest of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but most scholars agree that this book is late, probably put in its final form after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. So what we have in Leviticus's sacrificial lists is the catalog written after centuries of practice. not directives about how the temple you hear about in the Old Testament was to run. On the other hand, archaeology has uncovered texts that reveal to us far more about Canaanite religion, that is, the religion of Israel's ancient neighbors in the Levant. And from this, we see that Canaanite religion knows the exact same types of sacrifice, the whole offering, the shalom communion offering, and so forth. The exact same types are part of Canaanite religion as well, even the Day of Atonement, as we'll see. A final preliminary point. The sacrifice of animals in the temple was rarely thought of as a way to deal with God's need to punish sins. That view is present, but far less prominent than, say, making a gift to God of the produce of the land or flocks, or participating in a common meal. And each of the sacrifices often has several motives, and we'll talk about those as we go along. The sacrifices fall into 5 categories. The first is in chapter 1, the burnt offering or whole offering. In Hebrew, it's called olah. Older translations called it a holocaust, but we tend not to use that word anymore. It's called a whole offering because it's completely burned up and offered to God. Not for him to eat. Verse 9 describes it as a sweet-smelling oblation to the Lord. Scent is far more important here than eating. God liked the smell rather than he needed to be fed. He shall then slaughter the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer its blood by splashing it on all the sides of the altar. So it's the person bringing the animal who kills it. This is important. The priest is the one who offers the animal up on the altar, but you who brought your sheep, you're the one who's going to kill it. And if we look closely, the death of the animal is separated from the actual offering. Verse 7 says, Aaron's sons, the priest, having put the burnt embers on the altar, they shall lay the pieces of meat on the altar, and then they burn it up to the Lord. So what makes the sacrifice is the offering at the altar, not the killing. This is a strong contrast with the way animal sacrifices were treated in ancient Greece, for example, where the animal's death was central. The second offering takes place in chapter 2, and it's of grain. In Hebrew, it's called the mincha, and it can be presented in any number of forms. You can make a grain offering baked in an oven, so long as it's unleavened flour mixed with oil and some salt, or you can fry it in a pan in oil, a sort of fritter for God. You can also make it boiled like a dumpling, or you can simply offer the grain by itself in its unprocessed form. Any of these count as the grain offering. In the second temple, this grain offering was made every afternoon. Today, mincha is the name for the afternoon prayers in Judaism. And in fact, already in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, chapter 3, verse 1, it says that Peter and John were going up to the temple area for the 3 o'clock hour of prayer. That would have been this afternoon grain offering. Chapter 3 brings the next offering, this one a shalom offering. You might translate this as a peace offering. Other Bibles translate it as communion sacrifice. It's also described in Leviticus 7, verses 28 to 36, and in chapter 19, verses 5 through 8. This sacrifice can be offered for a number of different reasons, sometimes out of devotion, sometimes in fulfillment of a vow, and sometimes it's simply thanksgiving to God. It's an animal sacrifice like the first one, but what distinguishes this offering from the others is the eating of the flesh of the sacrifice. A portion of the remains are given to and eaten by the lay worshipers and the priests. And God was seen as an invisible guest at this communion meal. Part of it was burned up on the altar as an oblation to the Lord. Part of it was eaten by the people, and part of it was eaten by the priests. All of them joining in this meal together. Now, we then get to sacrifices that have something to do with sins. The one in chapter 4 is usually called the sin or purification offering, and the one in chapter 5 is called the guilt or reparation offering. But it's not so simple as thinking that this is the sacrifice you do if you've done something wrong and now you don't want God to kill you. Notice what chapter 4, verse 2 says. Tell the Israelites when a person inadvertently does wrong by violating any one of the Lord's prohibitions. And then it goes on into how you perform this animal sacrifice. It's the same in verse 13. If the whole community of Israel errs inadvertently and without being aware of it violates any of the Lord's prohibitions and thus are guilty, when the wrong that was committed becomes known, you make this offering. So this is for involuntary sins. And the same thing is true for the sacrifice described in chapter 5, the guilt or reparation offering. Verse 15, when a person commits sacrilege by inadvertently misusing any of the Lord's sacred objects. So this too is for unintentional sins. What we'll see is that only the Day of Atonement deals with intentional sins that a person later comes to regret. This is important because there's a common misconception that the daily function of the temple in Jerusalem was all about people who'd felt they'd done something wrong and they thought that God wanted to punish or even kill them, and so they killed an animal instead. That's clearly not accurate. The only two offerings that deal with sin explicitly deal with involuntary, unintentional acts. At the end of this lecture, when we get to the Day of Atonement, we'll see how intentional wrongs were dealt with. The next several chapters continue with more regulations concerning the conduct of the priests. And then, beginning in chapter 10, running through chapter 15, we have a section that scholars like to call the Manual of Impurities. So much of the ancient world had a concept of purity and impurity. This is not the same as good and evil. Uncleanliness is not a malevolent quality as much as it is an aesthetic state. And this is why so many religions have ritual washing. There's a great deal of ceremonial washing in Judaism, and ceremonial washing before prayers in Islam. These have nothing to do with sin. Instead, they derive from the concept of holiness. Holiness means separate. It means set apart. It means dangerous. And God is all of those things. So a system is set up to sanctify everyday life so that this dangerous, holy God can remain present in the midst of his people. So a person could have been rendered unclean by certain bodily functions that are not in and of themselves wrong. You could be rendered unclean by burying the dead, even if it was your deceased parent, when the act of burying your parents is certainly virtuous. You would still have to be purified before entering the temple. Moreover, things that were unclean for Israelites were not seen as necessarily wrong for non-Israelites. The dietary laws, for example. In general, Israelite religion and Judaism do not see any problem with a Gentile, a non-Jew, consuming food that's not kosher, that doesn't.
All right. So hopefully that will help you understand a little bit more of the offerings and laws regarding worship in ancient times, including bringing offerings to the temple. So we've got this book of Leviticus right here in the middle of, or actually the earliest parts of Genesis, because we want to be able to have some reference or some framework from which to understand what is happening when people are bringing offerings to Yahweh throughout the Old Testament. Remember that Leviticus also is a text that's really given to Moses and Aaron, and it's for the use and instruction of the priests. Every day people would know what to do based on what priests would tell them and what they became familiar with as a routine in their worship. The purposes of the Leviticus text then, besides instruction for the priests, are to provide a ritualized form of worship that will show and build the relationship between God and the people, and between the people and God. So both ways. The provisions are also for the restoration of relationships between people from person to person. The laws are to keep Israel as a united people of faith with the rituals that are different from the cultures around them. In Leviticus 18, it says, "You will not do as they do in the land of Egypt or in the land of Canaan." So the instructions are specifically for Israel, for the Israelite people. They are not to be the same as the people around them. In other cultures, they are their own unique monotheistic form of worship. So here we found that in the 3rd and 4th chapters of Genesis, there were already people everywhere. And so it's obvious, as the person in the video said, that there were many cultures settled throughout Mesopotamia. And in the case of Cain and Abel, once Cain commits his crime of murder, he flees to an area known as the land of Nod. Nod is actually a word that means wilderness. So he fled into the wilderness, and his descendants continued there. So after Abel is dead, Cain represents a line of descendants that do not follow in the ways of Yahweh's laws. Now Adam and Eve have another son, and they name him Seth. Seth's line of descendants will eventually bring the story up to the time of a patriarch known as Abraham. So all the generations named from Seth's line tell us that the people of Israel are connected to Yahweh from way back when. The genealogy is really a roadmap, making sure that we, or the people who are hearing the story in ancient times, know that the story is going to go on through the line of Seth and not Cain. So it is Seth's line of ancestry that is close and remains close to God. Seth's line follows God, as verse 26 of Genesis 4 says, "And at that time people began to call on the name of Yahweh," which means they began to worship Yahweh. So we're in the time where we are moving towards monotheistic religion. Seth's line takes us all the way up to Noah, and eventually from there on to Abraham. So as we end this lecture, we'll try the video again and see if it plays, on the portion about describing atonement. I found very interesting. So let's see if we can move on there.
At the beginning of the festival, the high priest, referred to as Aaron, the first high priest and the brother of Moses, sacrifices a bull for his own sins and then enters into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, the gold-covered wooden chest containing the tablets of the law. The only day in the year when anyone entered the Holy of Holies was the Day of Atonement, when the high priest did so at the beginning of this feast. Next, verse 5 states, "From the Israelite community he shall receive 2 male goats for a purification offering." Verse 7 says, "Taking the 2 male goats and setting them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, he shall cast lots to determine which one is for the Lord and which one is for Azazel." And we'll come back to that name. "The goat determined by lot for the Lord, Aaron shall present an offering up as a purification offering. But the goat determined by lot for Azazel will be placed before the Lord alive, so that with it he may make atonement by sending it off into the desert." So, there are 2 goats, and both goats are to atone for the sins of the people, including intentional sins. In verse 15, the high priest slaughters the goat of the people's purification offering and then sprinkles the Ark of the Covenant with its blood. And what it says is happening here is revealed in verse 16. "He shall purge the inner sanctuary of all the Israelites' impurities and trespasses, including all their sins." The role of the sanctuary in the life of the people is in danger of becoming lost. And this goat is offered to remove their sins and impurity, to purge the sanctuary. I think there's a bit of psychology involved here because, well, it might be helpful for some people to see the blood as cleaning the pollution of the sanctuary. Many people need another way to think of all their sins and wrongdoings being taken away. So in verse 20, when the priest is finished purging the inner sanctuary, Aaron shall bring forth the live goat, and laying both hands on its head, he shall confess over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and their trespasses, including all their sins, and so put them on the goat's head. He will then have it led into the wilderness by an attendant, and the goat will carry off all their iniquities to an isolated region. So there goes all the sins out into the wilderness, bye-bye, which raises the question, where are they going? And what does it mean to send the goat off to Azazel in the desert? And the truth is, we don't really know. The rabbis argue that Azazel is a place name. The late 4th century Vulgate translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Latin translated Azazel as the noun escape, scapegoat, or scapegoat. And this is where we get the term. So just as the scapegoat bears the guilt for everyone else in the office, so this goat takes everyone's sins out into the wilderness. It's the goat that escapes. In fact, the Septuagint had already translated Azazel as a common noun meaning escape, which is an approximation of what the Hebrew means. Some of the books of the Apocrypha, or books that didn't make it into the Jewish or Christian canon of the Bible, including the Apocalypse of Abraham, held that Azazel was the name of a demon, or even the chief demon. There is a suggestion in Leviticus 17:5-7 of demons dwelling in the wilderness, but it doesn't make any sense to see one goat as an offering to God and another goat as an offering to a demon named Azazel. That's not how the second goat functions. It doesn't seem to be an offering to anything. Still, if Azazel is a demon, which is as likely as anything else, then goat for Azazel could simply mean go to the devil. One goat is for washing away sins, and the other is for my sins to go to the devil. This Azazel business must be the oldest part of the Day of Atonement ritual because it seems so heterodox as part of the Israelite cult. In fact, the entire Day of Atonement had a counterpart in ancient Canaanite religion. So the Day of Atonement takes place 1 week from Rosh Hashanah, the autumn new year. Canaanite religion had a feast of the autumn new year where the king made atonement. And that act included going over an extensive list of sins, which are called chatat. It's the same word as used in Hebrew for sin. So Leviticus sets out the ways the Israelites were to live as God's people, including the methods and modes of worship, as well as the ways to preserve holiness by avoiding uncleanliness and the imperfect. And it provides a yearly means for the nation, which was bound to fall short of holiness some of the time, to renew its ritual connection to God.
Here is a picture of a goat that is sent off into the wilderness. Sometimes they would wrap red yarn around the horns of the animal. Yom Kippur is what we call it, the Day of Atonement. This year is September 24th and 25th, and it is considered the holiest of all of the high holy days. So as we went through this section of chapters 3 and 4 of Genesis, what things were brought to mind for you? Did you notice any themes? How was God relating to the people, and how were the people relating back to God? I think we saw a good portion of that with the laws in Leviticus. Leviticus is not necessarily meant to be read by the layman in the Jewish tradition, but it was really the instructions for the priests and how to handle and how to explain what each part of worship was for. So again, just think, what comments, questions do you have about this portion of scripture? What does it make you think of? And we will continue on next week. Here's your suggested reading, chapters 6 through 9, which will include in Genesis the flood story that we're all probably pretty familiar with, Noah and the ark, and it's a pretty interesting story. And then in chapters 10 and 11, if we get that far, it is the transition chapters between the mythology of Genesis, early books or early chapters, into what's more likely to be able to be documented or proven that there was actually some of the lives of the patriarchs. In chapters 10 and 11, we make a transition to meeting Abraham and so on. Have a great week.